I would tell people when looking for a mentor, look for someone who is different than you, that can help you gain some influence, that can help you gain a different insight into some things that you may be missing by trying to find someone that's the same race or the same gender or sexual orientation as you. So mentorship can be used as a way to expand a person's understanding about themselves, not just the workplace.
Welcome to Empathy Affect, Fors Marsh Media's podcast that explores the human side of government. I'm Melissa Harris, and welcome to part 2 of this month's special on the role of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIA, in the federal workforce. Last time, we chatted with the Office of Personnel and Management's DEIA Director, Dr. Janice Underwood, about all of government's strides to strengthen agencies' personnel with DEIA principles. I encourage you to check out that episode if you haven't already. Today, we're continuing the conversation at a more personal level as we learn about the key role that mentorship, coaching, and sponsorship play in developing a DEIA-forward workplace culture. With us is National Science Foundation Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer Dr. Charles Chuck Barber, and Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity Chief, Dr. Teresa Horn. Dr. Barber has served as Dr. Horn's mentor over the years, and as you'll hear in a moment, the relationship is one that exemplifies how both mentors and mentees find immense growth, both personally and professionally. Today, we'll get to learn about the relationship and how they view mentorship as a vehicle for fostering a future of diverse, supportive leaders. Drs. Horn and Barber, I'm so thrilled to have you two here on Empathy Affect. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So I know we're here largely to talk about your relationship as mentor and mentee, but I think it'd be important to just start the conversation by defining mentorship, especially since it can look so different from person to person. There's mentorship in professional development, emotional and social support, or career-related support. So what does mentorship mean to the two of you?
For me, I'll look at it, more so from that cultural aspect. I think a mentor is someone who sees potential in an individual more so than that individual will see in themselves, and I think also, I see mentorship as not just helping somebody reach career goals, but also just creating that space for somebody to find and create the best image of themselves, so that's really how I see mentorship.
And I'll piggyback on that and say, I really think mentorship means that you have someone that can help you navigate your career, right? See things differently from your own perspective and offer you positive ways to achieve your goals, whether it be career related or personal goals that you have. And so I think it also helps open social circles and opportunities to you. And a mentor can be sort of like a confidant, right? And a guide. And they give you that emotional support when you encounter those rough days at work. You have someone to call and help you work them out. So I think that's the most important thing when I think of mentorship. It's almost synonymous with relationship.
Right.
Yeah, that's well said, Teresa. Particularly with how tough it is in this space, that's important. That's important.
So clearly you guys have some solid foundation for how you view mentorship overall, but as I mentioned before, mentor-mentee. From what I understand, Dr. Barber, you are Dr. Horn's mentor. So I'd love to learn how you two met. Tell me about how you became mentor-mentee.
Well, I have ties to the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency where Dr. Horn works. And when they were kind of through the recruiting process for bringing in a seasoned leader for that role, because of my ties with the organization, I knew right off the bat I was going to reach out and try to extend the ability to be a partner and build a relationship for the incumbent, but, fortunately with it being somebody like Teresa, somebody who's just a student of a craft and continuously wants to learn, it just made it very organic to kind of build that mentor and mentee relationship.
Yeah. And I will say this, shameless plug for LinkedIn. So it's easy to cyber stalk mentors. and so that was happening in the background. I don't think Chuck knows that. I didn't share that I was kind of creepy in the beginning, but I think it's when you're using online as a way to follow someone's career and what they're doing in the space, it really speaks volumes to who they are, in this industry. And so I would say LinkedIn was a huge plug for the start of it, even in an informal sense, where I was just watching and seeing the work that he was doing on a bigger level and saying, I really want that for my career. Right. And so when we really started speaking about it, I already had that background knowledge of what he had been working on and what he was doing. And so even though it wasn't a formalized, can you be my mentor? It was more around, I love what you're doing. How are you doing these things? Can you give me some advice? And so, you need a person who's willing to help you, guide you, and see something in you. And so I appreciate that it was mutual, but it definitely started long before I think we met.
I did not know that. But thank you for the kind words, Teresa. But Teresa, I've already told you this before. You already have the it factor, for how to make progress in this space. So it's the relationship there is just it's just natural.
Well, I'm glad we're sort of uncovering some rocks here with Dr. Horn's honesty. But, you explained how you found Dr. Barber on LinkedIn and followed him. But as you cultivated your relationship, could you tell us about how Dr. Barber's mentoring has helped you navigate your career in government and perhaps ground that in, what kind of role mentorship can overall play in the realm of the federal workforce?
Ooh, that's a good question, Melissa. I think, in terms of Chuck's mentoring, right? So our mentor mentee conversations are confidential. So I won't tell you all the great advice I've received when I'm going
No
through troubled
worries.
waters. But what I will say is that his advice has helped me when learning how to deal with different personalities, right? Different needs and wants. And his advice also helps me think through my plans, right? So when I'm having an idea and I'm brainstorming around problem solving, he's been that person that I can reach out to and say, this is what I'm thinking. Am I off the mark? How should I go about it? And it's not always about agreement. I think people get very caught up in my mentor should agree with everything that I'm doing and I should agree with their feedback. And that's not true, right? Sometimes we don't agree, right? And it's about having the conversation and working through your thoughts with someone that you trust and has your best interest at heart. And so I think that's the way that Chuck's mentoring has really helped me navigate my career in government. And then in terms of the federal work environment and the role that mentoring plays in that, I think, there are so many mentorship programs that I think we formalize in the federal government. And I think that the federal government differs in so many ways from the private industry because while the process is the same, right, political savvy plays a role in our side of the house, right?
Right.
Federal government mentorship relationships, where that may not be the case for private industry, which is largely money driven. So while having a mentor in private industry can help you expand revenue, on our side, on the federal government side, it's really learning to navigate political challenges when you're moving up into leadership roles. So I'll turn it over to Chuck. I'm sure he has some insights on this one as well.
My chest is swelling up like a proud mentor listening to you talk. Uh, I think probably the only thing I can probably offer to what you just provided is, there's when you think about those complexities in the federal government versus the private sector. In the private sector, you're going to be more susceptible to some of those compelling state interests. Whereas,
Mhm.
and on the federal side, you're more susceptible to some of those compelling government interests. I mean, look at what's going on with the DEI laws that keep popping up across the country right now.
Yeah.
So that's another level of complexity that you have to think about. But I would also offer, you heard Teresa kind of talk about, advice that I've kind of given her, to kind of navigate some challenges in the federal space. But she's been, from a reverse mentoring perspective, she's been just as valuable, because being able to see how she thinks about different problems that I may not have thought about, in a way that she kind of looks at some of those things. So that reverse mentoring has been
Mhm.
just as valuable.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love hearing about the reverse mentoring. We could always learn from each other. Since you two both work in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility space, how do you see mentorships increasing representation and inclusion across the federal workforce? And can you draw from, some of the examples from your relationship to sort of spotlight the importance of it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. What I would say is I think mentoring absolutely has a critical role, in helping us to address gaps with representation. But I think the mentoring piece is just a part of it. I think the sponsorship
Mhm.
component is something that absolutely has to be integrated into the equation, because while mentoring just kind of helps you navigate, different career maps and things of that nature, that sponsorship is what's going to be powerful, because in some cases you need that sponsorship to get you at the front end of an opportunity, and so
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I make that apparent. Teresa, you may have some other thoughts.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% there. I even will go even farther than that, in terms of mentorship, coaching, and sponsorship. I think they all go line in line, hand in hand together. But, in terms of whether we see mentorship increasing representation across the federal workforce, I'm a little in the gray area on that one, right? Because
Mm.
I think mentorship can absolutely increase DEIA, right? I've seen mentors who have no knowledge of DEIA, and because they mentor a person in the space, even they begin to understand why DEIA is important, right? So I had a mentee who was a white woman, and her and I would speak candidly about our challenges in the workplace. And her understanding of my situations that I was going through opened her eyes to how we both may be women dealing with some forms of oppression, but being a Black woman added an additional burden onto my experiences. And so she learned something even through our mentorship relationship that opened her eyes to a form of DEIA. And I've also led mentorship programs that this has happened in reverse, right? So I would tell people when looking for a mentor, look for someone who is different than you, that can help you gain some influence, that can help you gain a different insight into some things that you may be missing by trying to find someone that's the same race or the same gender or sexual orientation as you. Right. And so mentorship can be used as a way to expand a person's understanding about themselves, not just the workplace, right? So that's, I think, one of the key things when I link mentorship to DEIA is that there's an opportunity there.
Right.
Listen, what she said was powerful, because she kind of just gave you a blueprint for how to increase allyship, and
Mhm.
also how the power of like reverse mentorship or mentoring. That's also an opportunity to kind of help with multicultural competence sharing back and forth.
Mhm.
So it's very, very powerful.
Mhm.
Exactly. I love that we talked about sponsorship, allyship. These are all really integral because mentorship it's very personal, but it's a different thing to take it to another level.
Yeah.
So, in thinking about representation, research in the past few years has even pointed to the fact that sponsorship is a necessity for underrepresented professionals to really thrive. Defining sponsorship as an evolution of a mentoring relationship where the sponsor intentionally talks about and advocates for their sponsee is similar to
Mhm.
the difference between an ally and an accomplice. So that brings us sort of full circle here with what we were just chatting about. How do you see sponsorship playing a role in furthering DEIA work and initiatives over time?
I'll tell you, I think sponsorship is going to become even more important, than it was so before, particularly when you think about what just happened with the Supreme Court decision with abolishing, affirmative action, because
Mhm.
now you can use sponsors to kind of really help address the cultural component of this. There's going to be a lot of data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative data, that can help you address underrepresentation through an equity lens. But when you can leverage sponsorship to kind of help you address some of those keystone leadership behaviors that may attribute to underrepresentation, that's when becomes really powerful. So, as a sponsor, you can highlight your sponsee as a qualified candidate who deserves that opportunity. Whereas before,
Mhm.
because of some of those keystone leadership behaviors, you've heard the term ducks pick ducks. Well, now you can use
Mhm.
a sponsorship to kind of help you, get your diverse candidate who's qualified. And I'm not saying sacrifice meritocracy for the sake of diversity. They need to work in harmony. But when you pick the
Mhm.
right kind of sponsors who are qualified to do so, That's how you can start to make a difference with moving the needle with underrepresentation.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll even say too. You said it earlier, Chuck, about culture, right? That is the North Star. That's where we're trying to get to. And so sponsorship is the key to changing culture around how we see representation at the top and in our critical positions. Right. So sponsorship is sort of a form of mentorship, but very different in that it moves to action around career development and advocacy. And so when I think about it, sponsorship should be born from mentorship and coaching.
Right.
And I kind of alluded to that earlier. I do think it's important to note that sponsorship shouldn't happen for the sake of sponsorship, right? It has to be intentional, right? If you're trying to increase diversity in your leadership ranks, it will not be just speaking the name and the good deeds of someone who's diverse, right? I think it means finding the opportunities that allow them to shine and then also preparing them to do the work at that level. So this is why it's important to keep equity in mind, right? You don't want this to become a favoritism issue where only those who are liked or are in the in crowd or solely based on race, sexual orientation, gender, or all those other things, that those are the ones that are chosen to be sponsored. So this is why I say it must be a mentorship, coaching, sponsorship link, right? They go hand in hand, right? The first step is to mentor, build the relationship, know what they want and who they are. The next step is coaching, right? You help the person move towards their goals and provide the feedback and the guidance and the resources for them to be successful. Then and only then do you sponsor them and highlight them to other leaders, right? This should be the way it's run because it's very disjointed currently. Even in private industry, it's following the same disjointed pathway, right? When we take mentorship, coaching, and sponsorship, and they're seen as distinct silos with similar goals, right? We're moving away from it being more of a step-by-step process towards one end goal.
That makes me think, as your relationship has evolved over time, you were talking about how it doesn't just end at mentorship, but it goes to sponsorship and beyond. How has the two of you's relationship evolved over time, especially now that Dr. Barber, you've gravitated toward NSF away from defense? Your career pathways have developed in different ways. How have you, continued to build and support each other, especially since we talked about that reverse mentee sort of element before?
I'll tell you, any mentee that I take on, one of the goals I have is to develop your mentee to the point to where they actually become a peer. And I think that's especially important in the DEI space because we have to continue to build a DEI enterprise if we really want to make this work, enduring, and so some of that hinges on how you can teach others about soft skills and gestures that a mentor is going to use, and so naturally, because of my relationship with Teresa, particularly in the DEI space, being able to kind of mentor her to the point where she's not a mentee anymore, but a peer, that's starting to happen organically. I mean, there's times when I pick up the phone and I say, well, hey, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? And I'm not asking her, as a mentee, I'm asking her that as a peer, or as a partner. So I think eventually that's what a relationship should grow to. Is teach a mentee, they can get to the point to where their mentors, become their peers.
Yeah, and I'll just foot stomp that 100%. And I truly believe when you're mentoring correctly, that's where it should go, right? And our relationship has expanded and grown over time because, again, that authenticity, that trust, that's built up throughout the relationship as you're sharing challenges that you have and you're listening to this person's advice and then you're putting it in action and you're seeing that you're moving forward in a positive direction. That trust grows, right? And so, as both of us sort of embark on our own journeys and we shift agencies and shift roles, right? We still share ideas and we still bounce those alternatives off of each other because we respect each other's viewpoint in the space. So I think we're both skilled in this industry. And so there's a lot to gain by having these candid conversations about what we're dealing with. And it not only, I think, prepares us for similar challenges in our workplaces, but introduces us to new ways of seeing the same problem. And I truly believe that Chuck's mentorship, friendship has led me in my career to be a better leader, has made me a better team member and peer to others, and a better friend. So it is something that develops over time into multiple different relationships and expands out.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Teresa, when you mention trust, it makes me think about lowering the bar to entry to work in the federal government, feeling like you
Yeah.
belong, and trusting that the agency you work for can support you. I understand that there's a challenge in getting people to enter work in the intelligence and national security space. And oftentimes that's because the prospect of the security clearance process is intimidating.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about how you're trying to demystify the clearance process and if strategies we've talked about today can help build that trust?
Yeah, yeah, and you're so right. Just around the process being intimidating. If you have not worked in federal government or the military, going through the security clearance process can seem like a very intrusive process. And so, really, what I am aiming for in terms of DIA is, we look at it from this lens of our internal and external piece of the pie, right? So, I'm working on making sure that where I work in itself is diverse and inclusive and fair and all of that. But I'm also thinking about it on a larger picture in terms of national security, because that is why we are doing what we do at DCSA. And so I will say that it has been, very interesting to see how diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility play out in terms of national security and how we assist in the public's understanding of what we do and the why behind it, right? So since we know that background investigations are probably one of the most stressful things you can go through as an applicant, waiting to get that new job and be cleared. I found out early on when going around to various speaking events and doing these engagements that audience members would come up to me and they would ask me questions that really allayed to their fears around background investigations, right? And so they were sharing some things with me that were clearly myths, that I was sitting there saying, well, that's not true. And so, they would share things with me about, oh, their cousin didn't get a clearance because of, this reason. And so it made me stop and really realize that, there are people who aren't applying for national security positions because they're listening to these myths, right? And because there's a fear of the unknown. And I realized that as an industry, right, we need to get better at marketing around the public's understanding of what we do and why we're working hard to keep bias out of the process. So I devised a communication campaign called the Navigating the Clearance Process campaign to reach targeted areas in the public. So disability advocacy groups, military installations, HBCUs, LGBTQ plus advocacy groups, and a host of others to really speak to the questions they may have around things like, if I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community and I haven't come out, right? Will that be an issue when I'm filling out my background investigation, right? Or from a military person who's traveled to multiple countries and lived all around the world and maybe has a foreign born wife, right? And has close family ties in another country, right? They have questions around how the process will be impacted by that relationship. And so this campaign that I put together really helps answer those questions, demystify the process of what DCSA does, and hopefully get more underrepresented candidates to apply for roles in national security. Because our nation is its safest when we have the greatest minds on deck, right? Questioning things, thinking differently. And we can't have that level of safety if a swath of our workforce is not diverse and is not from different backgrounds. So thank you for allowing me to speak more about that, because it is a huge part of what we're working on here at DCSA.
Absolutely. And Dr. Barber, you yourself came from the defense space. You only came to NSF just recently after spending an extensive career in defense. So, what has it been like shifting from the Navy to NSF in the DEIA space? what elements of your work overlap with both agencies, and what challenges do you face that are unique to each agency?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I would start off and to say that the journey has been incredible. Thanks to Dr. Punch and Nathan and the rest of our NSF leadership for really just giving me the trust and autonomy to really leverage a bigger platform. While I loved working over at the Department of Defense, we just have a much bigger platform here at NSF because of the reach that we have across different sectors. We touch the academic sector with the work that we're doing with universities, other federal agencies, within the STEM space, and then private sector. And so given the role that I'm in now, not only am I focusing on the internal capacity with advancing culture and DEI, but there's also an external component that you have to look at too, with how we award grants and things of that nature for research and solicitations. And so just that bigger platform has been incredible. So incredible.
Awesome. So, as we're sort of wrapping up here, I want to reach out to our listeners. Clearly, you two have a lot of experience in the DEI space. Your relationship as mentor and mentee has been really illuminating. And I feel like, most people who find themselves looking for mentors are young folks looking to start in any journey in their career. So, what advice would you give folks, especially young folks, who are looking to work in government for the first time when it comes to seeking mentors?
I'd tell young people to just learn your role first, right? Then find a mentor who you feel an affinity for and that you respect, right? Don't go for the most powerful one, right? Go for the person who has influence and is willing to share with you through each of the phases of mentorship, coaching, sponsorship, right? If you really don't have a deeper connection with your mentor, let it go and find another one, right? You have to want to tell them your secrets and you have to trust them. They have to want to tell you their stories and how they overcame them. So if you're not getting the feeling of a two-way street, find someone else, right? It should feel like an organic conversation with a person who is truly, truly interested in you and wants to see you do well.
I would say they should probably kind of follow Teresa's example, do your research. When you identify, somebody who could potentially be a mentor, do your research, similar to what like Teresa did with me. But I would say, while you're doing that research, don't just look at just the technical competencies. Try to think about a way to look at the morals of that individual too, because there's always going to be a humanity component that you need to keep at the forefront, as you ascend up your career chain. And that's going to be important for not just for society, for society and for the sake of democracy. So in addition to those technical skills, look for those morals and that humanity component also.
Definitely, especially since these relationships are all about how you can kindle them, having those soft skills.
Mhm.
And on the flip side, what do you want to tell people in government who'd make good mentees? What advice would you give them, and what kind of messaging do you think they could take to, either their mentors or their mentees? We could talk about the sponsorship piece. There are so many different ways they could take it. What do you want to tell them?
So, from a mentee's perspective, I will let you know that in order to be a good mentee, don't wait to be chosen, right? If you have things that you want to do in your career and you are very focused in your journey, and that's why I said earlier to know your craft first. It's easier to know where you're trying to go and bring someone into your plan versus not knowing what you want to do and where you want to go and not knowing if that mentor can really help you get to that point. So it really helps to know what you want to do in your career and have a plan for that and then fit the pieces together. I think some mentees don't even realize they need the relationship, right? So when a mentor is in your circle, you may not see them as a mentor, right? So I think building relationships should be the first step as a mentee. If you're not thinking, if you're not seeing every person as a mentor, really just build relationships. Be at that very basic level of finding your why, right? Why do you want to talk to this person? Why are they interesting to you, right? And then once you get that piece done, And you really are in that relationship mode with a person where you have that respect for what they do. They don't have to be in the same field as you, the same industry as you, but it's really about building that first organic relationship with an individual, and then you can move into mentorship from there.
Yeah, I like that, Teresa. I think the only thing I could probably offer to what the advice that I would give is, I think as a mentee, don't be afraid to look for opportunities to reverse mentor, because I think having
Mm,
that two-way dialogue absolutely strengthens the relationship. And always have your goals. Be ready to talk about the goals that you have,
yeah.
long-term and short-term goals. I think that's probably the best piece of advice I could probably offer.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Are there any other parting words before we wrap things up here today?
I'll go on the record and just let Dr. Horn know how incredibly proud I am of her. I continuously see this, watch her, ascend and reach some of her goals, and just listening to her kind of, express some of her perspective today, it just reaffirms that, that investment, with her as a mentor is been worthwhile.
Well, thank you, Chuck. My closing remarks, I would probably go with just giving a little bit of advice for folks, right? I think there's 2 points that can be very pivotal for you, right? Either you're starting a new career or you're going into a new industry, right? And having a guide can help you navigate that unknown, that feeling of confusion or fear. And so I think when we talk about when a mentor is needed, right? Because as a mentee, you don't really know when you need a mentor. It's just one of those things that organically happen. But I will tell you that I've found that it's 2 points that are when you really need one. And one of them is starting a new career or a new industry. And so look for those people if you're ever coming to those crossroads in your life, right? Having someone show you the difference between being a great technician versus being a great leader can be a very good time to have a mentor, because being a SME is very different from being a leader. And I think that was a lot of the advice that Chuck has given to me over the time that we have built our relationship, has been around me becoming a better leader. And I know that I'm a great SME. I know that I can do this work, but now it's a different level of understanding within this industry. So again, if you are unsure that you need a mentor, I would say look to 2 things in your life. If you're starting a new career or you're going into a new industry, absolutely look for someone to help you in those transitions.
And I would probably also offer, if you stand within those industries and if you're going to a new organization, rather
Yeah.
than seeking a new mentor, you might need to start to look for a sponsor.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
Well, thank you two for sharing a lot about your own relationship, for giving invaluable information and advice to many other professionals out there, both those who could be mentors or mentees. It's been really great chatting with you.
Thank you, Melissa. You as well.
Thank you.
I hope that you've enjoyed the conversations that we've had with Doctors Horn, Barber, and Underwood over this past month. And more importantly, I hope it makes you feel like you know how to find both support and thrive professionally working in government. Leaders like the 3 we've spoken to are here to make sure that you get a seat at the table. Thanks as always for joining us on Empathy Affect. Make sure you follow, subscribe, and share the show with your friends. I hope you'll join us next time.
Empathy Effect is a product of Fors Marsh. You can reach us at Fors Marsh Media at forsmarsh.com with any feedback, questions, or inquiries. If you want to know more about today's guest, are interested in participating with Fors Marsh, or becoming part of our community, check out our show notes for more information.